Ma'am, you need to leave. Right now. The words cracked through the ballroom louder than the string quartet playing beneath the crystal chandeliers. Conversation stopped. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Heads turned. For a moment, the entire charity gala seemed to hold its breath. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still in the center of the grand entrance hall, her black evening dress simple, elegant, and almost invisible among the designer gowns surrounding her. She carried no flashy jewelry. No entourage followed behind her. No one rushed to greet her. To most of the guests flooding the annual Bright Futures Charity Gala in downtown Chicago, she looked like a woman who had somehow wandered into a room where she didn't belong. That assumption was about to become the most expensive mistake of several careers. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi Brooks. The gala occupied the entire top floor of the Lakeshore Grand Hotel, a glittering venue overlooking Lake Michigan. More than 600 guests filled the ballroom. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, philanthropists. Every table carried centerpieces worth more than many families spent on groceries in a month. Cameras flashed. Servers moved silently between guests. It was supposed to be a celebration of generosity. Instead, it was becoming a public lesson in prejudice. Standing directly in front of Naomi was Richard Coleman, the head of event security. At 6'3" with silver hair and a perfectly pressed tuxedo, he carried himself like a man who never expected to be questioned. His expression hardened as he glanced at the tablet in his hand. "Your name isn't on the guest list," he said. "I'm asking you to leave before this becomes a problem." Naomi looked at him calmly. Her face revealed nothing. Not anger, not embarrassment, not fear, just patience. The kind of patience earned from decades of hearing people make decisions about her before learning a single fact. Around them, whispers spread like sparks across dry grass. "Who is she?" one guest murmured. "Maybe she came in through the service in trance," another replied. A woman wearing a diamond necklace worth more than a luxury car shook her head. "Security doesn't stop people without a reason." The comments floated through the air. Naomi heard every one of them. She simply folded her hands in front of her and remained silent. That silence seemed to irritate Richard even more. "Ma'am," he repeated, louder this time. "I need you to come with me." Nearby guests stepped aside, creating a path through the crowd. It looked less like an escort and more like a public walk of shame. Every eye followed her. Every assumption grew heavier. At the far side of the room, event director Victoria Langford finally noticed the commotion. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and began walking toward the entrance. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble floor. The closer she got, the more confident her expression became. She took one glance at Naomi and immediately decided exactly who she thought she was. And that decision was about to change the entire night. Victoria Langford stopped a few feet from Naomi Brooks and studied her with the quick confidence of someone who believed she could read an entire life in a single glance. The crystal chandeliers above scattered warm gold light across the marble floor, reflecting from polished surfaces and designer gowns. But Naomi remained the calm center of the growing commotion. Victoria crossed her arms and looked toward Richard Coleman. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, although her tone suggested she had already decided on the answer before hearing a single word. Richard handed her the tablet. "She is not on the guest list," he said. "I was in the process of escorting her out." Victoria barely glanced at the screen before handing it back. "Then there is no issue," she replied. "The solution seems obvious." Several nearby guests exchanged approving smiles. The response sounded decisive. Professional. Final. That was what made it so dangerous. Assumptions wrapped in confidence often sounded exactly like facts. Naomi watched quietly. There was something almost unsettling about her composure. Most people in her position would have argued by now. They would have demanded explanations. They would have tried to convince strangers of their importance. Naomi did none of those things. She stood as if the outcome no longer belonged to the people surrounding her. Victoria noticed the silence and mistook it for surrender. "This event is invitation only," she said. "We have major donors, corporate sponsors, elected officials, and media partners attending tonight. We cannot take chances." She looked Naomi up and down once more before making her decision. If your name is not on the list, you do not belong inside this ballroom. A few guests nodded immediately. To them, the statement sounded reasonable, orderly, responsible. Naomi tilted her head slightly. A disruption? She asked softly. That is what you believe this is? Victoria ignored the question entirely. I believe you should leave before this becomes uncomfortable. The irony slipped past her without notice. Across the ballroom, a jazz trio continued playing near the stage, but even the music felt distant now. More attention had shifted toward the entrance. Conversations faded into whispers. Assumptions filled the silence. Naomi Brooks had spent much of her life recognizing that look. People often believed success had a uniform. They expected luxury brands, visible status symbols, and unmistakable displays of wealth. Naomi wore none of those things tonight. Her black evening dress was elegant but understated. Her jewelry was minimal. Her presence was quiet. She looked like someone attending the event, not someone powerful enough to shape it. That had been intentional. Earlier that afternoon, she had arrived in Chicago from New York without assistants, security personnel, or publicity staff. She preferred seeing how people behaved when nobody believed they were being observed. Those moments often revealed more than executive meetings ever could. Near one of the registration tables, a young volunteer named Emily Carter glanced toward the entrance again. Something about Naomi seemed familiar. Emily frowned and searched her memory. During the previous week, she had helped organize sponsor materials, donor profiles, and presentation slides. She had seen hundreds of names and photographs. Yet the woman standing beside security tugged at her memory like a loose thread refusing to stay hidden. Emily looked again. The face, the posture, the voice. She knew she had seen her somewhere. Meanwhile, Victoria stepped aside and motioned toward the exit. Richard, please finish handling this. Richard nodded immediately. Of course. He gestured toward the glass doors overlooking Lake Michigan. This way, ma'am. Naomi looked briefly toward the massive ballroom stage at the far end of the room. Giant LED screens waited behind a velvet curtain. Staff members moved around final preparations. Everything was ready for the evening's most important moment. Almost everything. A faint smile touched Naomi's face before disappearing. Then, without protest, she began walking toward the exit while hundreds of eyes followed her every step. The crowd parted as Naomi walked toward the exit, and the movement felt strangely ceremonial, as though the ballroom itself had decided she no longer belonged. Richard Coleman remained a few steps behind her, maintaining the appearance of professionalism while ensuring every guest could see what was happening. That visibility mattered. People with authority often preferred their judgments to have an audience. Around the room, whispers multiplied. A hedge fund manager near the bar shook his head. They do not remove people unless something is wrong. His companion nodded immediately. Exactly. Security knows things we do not. The assumption spread from table to table with remarkable speed. Facts were absent. Confidence was not. Victoria Langford watched the scene unfold with growing satisfaction. Order had been restored. At least that was what she told herself. She turned back toward the registration area and signaled to several event staff members. Let us focus on the evening, she said. We have important guests arriving. Yet even as she spoke, she noticed more people looking toward Naomi than toward the ballroom stage. The attention irritated her. She wanted the incident finished. Instead, it seemed to be growing. Near the sponsor display wall, Emily Carter continued staring. The feeling in her stomach would not disappear. She knew that face. She knew it. Earlier in the week, she had spent hours organizing presentation materials for the gala. Donor profiles, corporate partnerships, foundation histories. The largest contributors received dedicated slides for the evening program. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remember where she had seen Naomi before. Then another volunteer approached her carrying a tablet. Emily, can you verify the sponsor rotation? He asked. Emily accepted the device absent-mindedly. As she scrolled through the presentation files, her heart skipped. There it was. A photograph. Not identical, but unmistakable. The same eyes. The same smile. The same woman currently being escorted toward the exit. Emily looked up sharply, then back down at the screen, then up again. A chill moved through her. No way, she whispered. Across the ballroom, Naomi reached the massive glass doors overlooking the lake. The Chicago skyline shimmered beyond the windows, glowing against the dark evening sky. Richard stopped beside her. "Thank you for cooperating," he said. Naomi looked out toward the city for a brief moment before turning back toward him. "Do you enjoy making decisions about people you have never met?" she asked. Richard frowned. "I am doing my job." Naomi nodded slightly. That answer usually sounds convincing to the person saying it. Richard did not know how to respond. Before he could speak again, Victoria arrived. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "None," Richard replied. "She was just leaving." Victoria offered a tight smile. "Good." Naomi studied both of them calmly. The expression on her face was not resentment. It was disappointment. Somehow that felt worse. Back near the registration tables, Emily suddenly began walking faster. Then faster still. She carried the tablet against her chest and moved through clusters of guests, trying to keep Naomi in sight before she disappeared. Her pulse raced with every step. Something was terribly wrong. And if the photograph she had just seen was what she thought it was, the entire gala was only minutes away from discovering a mistake so enormous that no apology in the room would be large enough to contain it. Emily Carter nearly dropped the tablet as she pushed through the crowd. The photograph on the screen stared back at her like a warning she could no longer ignore. She stopped beside a sponsor display and opened the profile again. The image showed the same woman who had just been escorted across the ballroom. The same calm eyes. The same composed smile. Emily checked the name beneath the photograph. Then she checked it again. Her stomach tightened. Around her, guests continued sipping champagne and discussing business deals, completely unaware that something enormous was unfolding only a few yards away. Emily looked toward the entrance doors where Naomi stood with Richard Coleman and Victoria Langford. Every instinct told her to speak up. Every fear told her to stay quiet. Victoria had a reputation. Everyone on the event staff knew it. Challenging her publicly was rarely a smart career move. Yet the longer Emily stared at the profile, the harder silence became. Across the ballroom, Victoria folded her arms and glanced at her watch. The evening schedule was running with military precision. In less than 20 minutes, the formal program would begin. Cameras were ready. Media partners were in position. Major donors filled the front tables. Everything appeared perfect. That illusion comforted her. She had no idea it was already cracking beneath her feet. Naomi remained near the glass doors overlooking Lake Michigan. The city lights reflected against the windows behind her, creating the image of a woman standing between two worlds. One inside, one outside, one welcomed, one rejected. Yet her expression never changed. She seemed almost detached from the tension surrounding her. Richard noticed it again. The calmness. The absence of panic. Most people asked questions. Most people demanded explanations. Naomi simply observed. "You are taking this surprisingly well," Richard said. Naomi looked at him. "People reveal themselves when they believe there are no consequences." Richard frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Naomi glanced toward the ballroom. "It means tonight has been very informative." Before he could respond, Emily finally reached them. Slightly out of breath, she stopped several feet away. "Victoria," she said, "I think there may be a mistake." Victoria turned immediately, irritation flashing across her face. "What is it, Emily?" Emily held up the tablet. "Victoria, please look at this." Her voice was firmer now. "I think you are making a mistake." Victoria's expression hardened instantly. "Emily, return to your station." "Please," Emily insisted. "Just read the profile." For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed Victoria's face. It appeared and disappeared so quickly that most people would have missed it. Then pride returned. "The matter is closed." Emily lowered the tablet slowly, but the feeling in her stomach only grew stronger. Some mistakes announced themselves immediately. Others arrived disguised as confidence. Richard looked from Emily to the screen she was holding. "What profile?" he asked. Emily hesitated. Victoria answered before she could. "An irrelevant sponsor document." Emily swallowed hard. "I do not think it is irrelevant." Nearby guests sensed something changing and began paying attention again. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. The atmosphere tightened. Naomi remained silent through all of it. Then she looked directly at Emily and offered the faintest nod. It lasted less than a second, yet it carried the weight of encouragement. Emily noticed. So did Richard. And for the first time all evening, a small seed of doubt began growing inside him. He looked at Naomi again, then at Victoria, then at the tablet. Suddenly, the certainty that had guided him throughout the evening no longer felt quite as solid as it had 30 minutes earlier. Emily stepped away, but her mind refused to let the issue go. She moved toward a quiet corner beside the sponsor displays and opened the event presentation again. This time she did not skim. She read every line carefully. Her eyes widened with each detail. Meanwhile, near the entrance, the atmosphere continued to shift. More guests were watching now. Some pretended not to stare, but their attention remained fixed on the woman standing beside the glass doors. Naomi Brooks could feel it. The judgment, the curiosity, the silent conclusions being drawn by strangers who knew nothing about her. She had felt that weight before. Many times. Years ago, when she was 17, she had attended a scholarship fundraiser in Detroit. She remembered the polished floors, the expensive suits, the feeling that opportunity might finally be within reach. She had arrived early, carrying a folder filled with application materials. A volunteer had looked at her for only a few seconds before assuming she was there to help clean up after the event. When Naomi explained that she was one of the scholarship candidates, the woman laughed awkwardly and said there must have been some mistake. The memory remained sharp even after all these years. Not because it stopped her, because it taught her something. The people making those assumptions never believed they were revealing anything about themselves. Yet they always did. Back in the present, Victoria Langford checked her phone and frowned. New messages were arriving from production staff. The evening program was approaching quickly. The keynote segment remained the centerpiece of the entire gala. Television crews had arrived. Donors expected a polished presentation. Everything needed to run perfectly. "Richard," she said quietly, "we need to finish this." Richard glanced toward Naomi. For the first time all evening, uncertainty lingered in his expression. "Maybe we should verify a few things first." Victoria stared at him. "Verify what?" The volunteer seemed convinced she recognized her. Victoria dismissed the concern immediately. A volunteer recognized a face. That is hardly evidence of anything. Naomi listened without interruption. Her calmness now felt less like patience and more like confidence. Richard noticed it again. The feeling bothered him. People removed from exclusive events usually became frustrated. Naomi seemed almost reflective. Across the ballroom, Emily finally found what she was looking for. A detailed sponsor profile opened on her screen. A photograph appeared beside a biography and a list of charitable initiatives spanning multiple states. Emily read the name once more. Then she looked toward Naomi. The realization landed with such force that she nearly stopped breathing. "Oh my God," she whispered. At that exact moment, another problem emerged. Near the stage, production staff began speaking urgently into headsets. One coordinator hurried toward the control booth. Another checked her watch repeatedly. A third made a phone call that went straight to voicemail. Confusion spread through the backstage area like a crack moving through glass. The keynote speaker was supposed to check in before the program began. No one could find her. Messages were unanswered. Schedules were slipping. The most important guest of the evening seemed to have vanished. Emily looked from the sponsor profile to Naomi, standing near the exit. Then she looked toward the increasingly worried production team. Suddenly, two separate mysteries became one. And when the pieces finally connected, she realized the gala was only minutes away from discovering that the person everyone was searching for was the very person they had already pushed aside. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed in ways most guests could not yet understand. On the surface, everything still appeared elegant. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. Waitstaff moved between tables carrying silver trays. Soft music drifted through the room. Yet beneath that polished exterior, panic was beginning to spread. Backstage coordinators checked schedules repeatedly. Phones rang unanswered. Headsets crackled with increasingly urgent conversations. The keynote segment was approaching, and the person scheduled to deliver it was nowhere to be found. "Has anyone reached her?" one producer asked. No response, another answered. "Try again." Across the room, Emily Carter moved quickly toward the production area with the tablet clutched against her chest. She no longer doubted what she had discovered. The evidence sat right in front of her. The woman standing near the exit was not an uninvited guest. She was one of the most important people connected to the entire event. Emily approached a senior event coordinator named Michael Harris. "You need to look at this," she said. Michael barely glanced up. "Not now? We have a crisis." "This is the crisis." Something in her voice made him stop. He took the tablet and studied the profile. His expression changed instantly. Where did you get this? From the sponsor archives. Michael read the page again, then a third time. The color drained from his face. Meanwhile, near the glass doors, Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she had been. She seemed entirely unbothered by the growing tension elsewhere in the ballroom. Richard Coleman watched her carefully. The doubts inside him were becoming impossible to ignore. "May I ask you something?" he said. Naomi looked at him. "You already have." Richard hesitated. "Why have you stayed?" Naomi glanced across the room, where staff members hurried between stations. "Because leaving would prevent people from learning what they need to learn." The answer lingered in the air. Richard found himself unable to dismiss it. Nearby, Victoria Langford continued receiving updates from production staff. Each message seemed more concerning than the last. "Still no contact?" she asked. "Nothing," a coordinator replied. "The board members are asking questions." Victoria forced a confident smile. "Then find her." But confidence was becoming harder to maintain. Questions began appearing from every direction. "Has Ms. Brooks arrived yet?" one board member asked. 5 minutes later, a television producer asked the same thing. Then a corporate sponsor. Then another donor. The questions spread through the ballroom with growing urgency. Nobody seemed able to answer it. Meanwhile, the woman everyone was searching for remained standing only a few yards away near the exit doors. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore. The closer the keynote presentation approached, the more people realized that the evening's most important guest was somehow missing. Across the ballroom, Michael Harris was already moving toward another executive organizer with Emily close behind. They reviewed the sponsor profile together. Then they compared it against the evening program. Then they looked toward Naomi. The connection became impossible to deny. "This cannot be happening," one organizer whispered. Emily answered quietly. "I think it already did." A fresh wave of urgency swept through the event staff. Several people began searching registration records. Others reviewed sponsor materials. One executive opened the official Gala program and stared at the featured biography printed inside. The photograph matched perfectly. Every path led back to the same conclusion. The room had spent the last half hour dismissing the very person everyone had been waiting for. Naomi noticed the shift immediately. Staff members who had ignored her earlier now looked in her direction with uncertainty. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others stared openly. The truth was moving through the ballroom faster than any announcement could carry it. And somewhere backstage, technicians received a final instruction. The giant LED screens behind the stage flickered to life as the evening program prepared to begin. Within minutes, every person in the ballroom would see exactly who Naomi Brooks was. And when they did, the entire room would understand what had really happened tonight. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the formal program prepared to begin. Conversations softened. Guests returned to their seats. Crystal glasses settled onto white tablecloths. Across the room, the giant LED screens behind the stage glowed to life, washing the ballroom in blue and gold light. For most of the audience, it felt like the start of another carefully planned charity presentation. For a handful of people scattered throughout the room, it felt like the beginning of a disaster. Victoria Langford stood near the entrance with growing unease. The confidence she had carried all evening was beginning to crack. Production staff moved past her without their usual composure. Several avoided eye contact entirely. Others looked toward Naomi and then quickly looked away. Victoria noticed every glance. She just did not understand them yet. Richard Coleman noticed them too. The difference was that he had already begun connecting the pieces. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter stood beside Michael Harris and several senior organizers. None of them were speaking. They simply stared at the stage screens as the opening presentation began. A voice from the sound system welcomed guests and thanked sponsors for their support. Applause filled the room. Then the introduction shifted toward the evening's most anticipated moment. "Tonight," the announcer said, "we celebrate leadership, generosity, and the belief that opportunity should never depend on circumstance." The audience applauded again. Naomi remained near the glass doors, calm as ever. She folded her hands in front of her and listened. The room that had spent the evening judging her now waited unknowingly for the truth. "Our keynote speaker," the announcer continued, "has transformed educational access for thousands of students across America." A photograph suddenly appeared on the massive screens. The reaction was immediate. Hundreds of heads turned at once. A wave of confusion swept through the ballroom. Then silence followed. Complete silence. The woman smiling from the screens overhead was Naomi Brooks. Her image stretched 30 feet high above the stage. Beside the photograph appeared a biography detailing her achievements, philanthropic work, and the foundation that had funded countless scholarships nationwide. The room froze. Forks stopped moving. Glasses remained suspended in midair. Conversations died instantly. Victoria looked up at the screen, then toward Naomi, then back to the screen again. The color drained from her face. Richard stared upward, unable to hide his shock. Every doubt he had felt throughout the evening suddenly became certainty. The announcer continued speaking. As founder of the Brooks Impact Foundation and principal benefactor of tonight's event, she has dedicated her career to creating opportunities for future generations. A gasp rippled through the ballroom. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Others lowered their eyes as realization settled over them. The person they had watched being escorted toward the exit was not an outsider. She was the reason many of them were sitting in that room at all. Emily closed her eyes briefly. She had been right. But even she had not anticipated how dramatic the revelation would feel. The announcer's voice echoed once more through the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Naomi Brooks. Every spotlight in the room shifted at once. Not toward the stage, toward the entrance, toward the woman everyone now recognized. Naomi stood quietly beneath the lights. The same woman, the same dress, the same calm expression. Nothing about her had changed. Only the room had. And as hundreds of stunned faces turned toward her, the weight of what had happened finally landed on every person present. For several seconds, nobody moved. The ballroom seemed suspended between two realities. One was the version of the evening people thought they understood. The other was the truth now glowing across 30-foot screens above the stage. Naomi Brooks stood beneath the spotlight while hundreds of guests stared in stunned silence. The transformation was remarkable because nothing about Naomi had changed. She wore the same dress, the same shoes, the same calm expression. The only thing that had changed was what everyone now knew. Victoria Langford felt the room slipping away from her. She looked around and saw the expressions she had hoped never to see directed toward her. Shock, disbelief, disappointment, questions she could not answer. Across the ballroom, several board members stood from their tables. They had arrived expecting to honor Naomi Brooks, not discover she had been denied entry to her own event. One of them, Thomas Reynolds, chairman of the Gala committee, walked quickly toward the entrance. His face carried none of the warmth he usually displayed at public functions. Richard Coleman noticed him approaching and immediately understood the significance. People parted to make room. Nobody wanted to stand in the path of what was coming. Thomas stopped in front of Naomi first. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Naomi met his eyes. "You are not the one who made the decision." She paused for a moment before continuing. "You did not remove me because I lacked an invitation." Her voice remained calm. "You removed me because you never believed I could belong here." For a moment, Thomas said nothing. The ballroom remained silent. The statement settled over the room like a weight nobody could ignore. Then he nodded once. It landed harder than any accusation could have. He turned toward Victoria and Richard. The silence that followed felt heavier than the applause that had filled the room minutes earlier. "Is there an explanation?" Thomas asked. Neither answered immediately. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it again, then tried once more. "We believe she was not on the guest list." Thomas stared at her. "The founder of this event." Victoria had no response. Around them, guests listened carefully. Nobody pretended to ignore the conversation anymore. The entire ballroom had become an audience. Nearby, Emily Carter watched with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Earlier that evening, she had been a volunteer trying to decide whether to speak up. Now the truth was unfolding in front of everyone. Several executives from the foundation joined Thomas near the entrance. One carried a tablet displaying sponsor records. Another held event schedules. Every document confirmed the same reality. Naomi was not simply attending the gala. She was the principal benefactor whose donations had helped build the organization into a national force. Scholarships, mentorship programs, educational initiatives across multiple states. Her vision had shaped nearly everything being celebrated that night. The irony settled heavily across the room. Guests who had whispered assumptions earlier now looked embarrassed. Some lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard stood silently. The weight of his own choices pressed against him. He remembered every moment, every assumption, every opportunity to stop and ask one more question. Victoria looked even more shaken. Her confidence had vanished completely. Authority had abandoned her the moment the screens revealed the truth. Naomi remained composed through all of it. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand revenge. She did not remind anyone of their mistakes. Somehow that restraint made the moment even more powerful. Then Thomas extended his hand toward the stage. "The evening belongs to you," he said. Naomi glanced toward the ballroom. Hundreds of guests watched her. The same crowd that had observed her removal now waited for her next step. She smiled faintly and began walking forward. This time, nobody moved aside to let her leave. They moved aside because she was exactly where she belonged. The ballroom remained on its feet long after the applause should have ended. Naomi Brooks stood beneath the stage lights while hundreds of guests continued clapping, not simply because of who she was, but because of what they had just witnessed. The same woman who had been treated like an outsider less than an hour earlier now stood at the center of the very event she had helped build. Yet even in that moment, Naomi showed no sign of triumph. She simply accepted the applause with quiet grace. As the audience slowly returned to their seats, conversations began spreading across the ballroom once again. This time, however, the whispers carried a different tone. The assumptions were gone. In their place came reflection, embarrassment, understanding. Near the back of the room, Thomas Reynolds remained in discussion with several board members. Their expressions were serious but controlled. No raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Just the steady process of accountability. A few moments later, Victoria Langford and Richard Coleman were asked to step aside for a private conversation. The discussion lasted less than a minute. Yet when it ended, both looked noticeably different. The confidence that had guided their decisions earlier had disappeared. For the remainder of the evening, they were relieved of guest management responsibilities pending a formal review of the incident. The decision was delivered quietly, professionally, yet everyone understood what it meant. Standards mattered, especially when they were ignored. Across the ballroom, Emily Carter stood near the side of the stage, still trying to process everything that had happened. Earlier that evening, she had been a volunteer wondering whether she should speak up. Now she found herself at the center of a lesson she would never forget. Naomi noticed her standing there and offered a small smile. It was simple, genuine, yet it meant more to Emily than any public recognition ever could. The formal program continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Guests who had spent the evening discussing investments and business opportunities now found themselves discussing character. Several donors approached one another and quietly admitted they had made assumptions. Others reflected on moments in their own lives when they had judged people too quickly. The lesson had spread far beyond the entrance hall. It had reached every table in the room. Later that evening, as the final presentations concluded and guests prepared to leave, many made a point of introducing themselves to Naomi personally. Not because of her title, not because of her success, because they wanted to thank her for the reminder she had given them. Naomi greeted each person with the same calm dignity she had carried throughout the night. She held no grudges. She demanded no special treatment. The event eventually came to an end, but the story did not. Weeks later, people would still talk about that evening. Not because of the donations raised, not because of the speeches delivered, because of a simple truth revealed in front of 600 witnesses. Respect should never depend on appearance. Dignity should never depend on status. And character is revealed most clearly when people believe nobody important is watching. As Naomi finally left the ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan, the city lights reflected across the glass behind her. She walked out exactly as she had arrived. Quietly, gracefully, unchanged. Because the person who had transformed that night was never Naomi Brooks. It was everyone else.